Welcome to the Authority File, the podcast where you'll hear conversations with academic librarians, technologists, researchers, and authors whose work is laying the foundation for higher education's future. I'm Bill Mickey, your host and the editorial director at Choice. If you're new to the Authority File, you can listen to and find previous episodes on all of the major podcast platforms, including Apple Podcasts, Google Play, Stitcher, and on our website, choice360.org. My guest for this series is Dr. Deanna Reder. Dr. Reder is a Cree Métis literature scholar. Her latest book is called Autobiography as Indigenous Intellectual Tradition, Cree and Métis Achamisawina, published by Wilfrid Laurier University Press. Dr. Reder has had an enormous impact on the development and growth of Indigenous literature studies in Canada. She's the current chair of the Department of Indigenous Studies at Simon Fraser University. Since 2007, she's helped build courses and curriculum at Simon Fraser to establish Indigenous studies as a separate discipline from post-colonial studies and Canadian literature. She served as series editor for Indigenous Studies at Wilfrid Laurier University Press from 2010 to 2021, developed workshops on how to teach Indigenous literatures, helped establish the Indigenous Literary Studies Association, co-founded the Indigenous Editors Association, and co-chairs the Indigenous Voices Awards, an awards program for Indigenous writers. I mention all of this because the study of Indigenous literature as a distinct discipline that brings with it specific methods of instruction and learning is a comparatively recent undertaking. It was only in 2001, when Dr. Reder began her doctoral work, that the field began to shift and orient itself toward a more authentic and more broadly recognized scholarly undertaking. In the next 4 episodes of this series, which is provided with support from Wilfrid Laurier University Press, Dr. Reder and I discuss her research background, her new book, The Growth of Indigenous Literature Studies, and her role in its development. In this first episode, we hear from Deanna about her research and early efforts to build courses and a full-fledged Indigenous Literature Studies department at Simon Fraser University. Okay, Deanna, welcome to the program.
Thank you for having me.
Sure. So let's start with a little bit about yourself. Where are you currently? And if you could talk a little bit about your research as well.
Oh, sure. So while I have lived all over Canada and my Cree Métis family is from northern Saskatchewan, I've been living in the lower mainland of BC for, 3 decades now, raised my kids here, and I work at Simon Fraser University. So I am really grateful to be both cross-appointed in the Department of Indigenous Studies and the Department of English, so that I have a real chance to help extend the field of Indigenous Literary Studies. And also, I have to say, I joined the Department of English when there already was an expert in Indigenous Literary Studies there, Sophie McCall, and so have the very happy experience of being able to work with someone else to do this. And so I'm really happy to talk to you today.
Great. So you began studying Indigenous literature after your undergraduate years. Mainly, I think, as you said, because it simply didn't exist at the university, more or less. Can you talk about then how you modeled your research as a result?
You know, if I could go back in time, I would assure the younger version of myself that everything was unfolding exactly the right moment. For personal reasons, I had to step away from going to school, and had kids and had different jobs in nonprofits mostly and that kind of thing, and really started to keep my ear to the ground because there were more and more talks about Indigenous literatures in the university. And I'm talking about, for example, in 1988, there was an important conference in Montreal, the International Feminist Book Fair. And I was an undergrad at the time, and I attended. And that's when I first sort of saw, in a university context, a whole bunch of Indigenous writers. They were all women poets at the there. And then reading Jeanette Armstrong's first book of literary criticism in the early 90s, and then and just so on and so on. So I started by buying books that I thought were interesting and reading them on my own, not expecting any future in the field. And until by the time I got around the year 2000, there were more books than I could kind of read and keep on top of. And so it was about that time my oldest son was going to university himself, and I applied to do my PhD in 2001. And so it ended up being perfectly timed, because the early 2000s were where Indigenous scholars were starting to complete their dissertations. And so I would start a chapter and literally walk on their work that had just come out through ProQuest. So I couldn't have done that work if I had gone to school earlier, because there wouldn't have been the conversation that had developed. And so I don't know exactly how I would label this research methodology, but timely anyway.
Great. So, was there anything at the time, in the early 2000s or around 2001 that, what was happening that suddenly all these scholars were coming onto the scene?
Well, somewhere, usually it's people look at the Creek scholar Craig Womack, who wrote Red on Red in 1999, but also Jeanette Armstrong really said similar things in the early 90s, which is, let's stop using other forms of sort of literary analysis and forcing it onto Indigenous literatures. Instead, let's look at the underlying logics within our own literatures and sort of form sort of what's called literary Indigenous nationalist approaches. So in other words, specific sort of Cree interpretations of Cree writing, or for Craig Womack being Native American, Creek interpretations of Creek literatures. Dan Justice has done Cherokee interpretations. And so that was really new. And I think also helped turn a lot of the generations of us were able to turn our back on previous conversations that just didn't engage us and start fresh. And I think that was really energizing.
Nice. Okay. So then, if we kind of move ahead and look at how Indigenous literary studies might relate to or not other literary studies programs, does it retain that kind of difference as you've just described?
Most of it is about the fact of how committed Indigenous literary scholars are to access, that we're not just interested in talking to each other, but that we are really interested in community feedback, but also in being able to be understood by community, so non-academics. And I think that has opened up a whole host of questions. I mean, even the question, for example, of rigor, that can often be a hidden code for a sort of meritocracy that we Indigenous literary scholars are trying to, not exactly oppose, but question anyway. And so we have sort of substituted the notion of rigor for vigor. Is there an energy? Is there a commitment to excellence, but that is got to do with connecting everyone in the room and into the conversation? And I think that's been really exciting and necessitated that Indigenous literary studies in Canada move out of Canadian literature and literary studies, but have it and be its own field. And that took some time.
Right. I love that vigor concept. I think that's really refreshing to hear. So when you started at Simon Fraser, you started developing courses and curriculum for the Department of Indigenous Studies. You also contributed to course development in the Department of English. And you've mentioned that, while you were doing that development, you had to, quote, build the house to live in it. Can you talk about that time and the work that went into creating those courses?
Well, when I started in the Department of Indigenous Studies, and back in those days, it was the First Nations Studies program, it was really there are very few courses. And so I was all about trying to get students. And my very first course was not Indigenous perspectives of sexuality and gender. No, it was sex and gender, Indigenous perspectives. And my second course was pop fiction, Indigenous perspectives. So that right away. And actually, I would say I got a pretty amazing first cadre of students. I mean, Smokey Sumac, who's an acclaimed poet now, was one of my students, including a whole other very talented group of people. And so I was not thinking so much about my own research, but trying to think about just ways of teaching literature to, at the time, mostly non-lit students. Occasionally, people like Smokey, who is also studying literature, but most of Indigenous studies students are not. They're majors in other things. So, but I didn't have to, with them, explain sort of very fundamental vocabularies. Meanwhile, in the Department of English, my colleague Sophie McCall had already instituted sort of a standard upper level course, but really that was it. And so I tried to infiltrate where I could. And so when I taught first year, introduction to literature, I just used all Indigenous lit because it was just the easiest way, and got some complaints for it. But then, these are classes of 300 students. They're going to be complainers.
Sure.
That's regardless of what you do. That's fine. And then when teamed up with the English department, their master's program that is around the schedules of working teachers, it's called NATE. We decided to substitute half of so 3 out of their 6 courses to be focused on Indigenous literatures. And that also was sort of a strategy to try to support teachers who are working in the public school system, to try to change the ecosystem, if you like. And Sophie's been the most recent director of that. But it's been a long process of really trying to infiltrate, change, and I think it's working.
Yeah, no, we'll talk a lot more about that in terms of all of the work you and a lot of your colleagues have put into changing the ecosystem, as you say. So your bio mentions that you became series editor for the Indigenous Studies series at Wilfrid Laurier University Press as a, quote, strategy to continue developing the discipline. Can you describe that strategy and why that was important at the time?
It's hard to emphasize enough, or that the sort of lack of books by Indigenous scholars in the field.
Yeah.
And added to that, the lack of resources. If you wanted to teach a third year course in Indigenous literary criticism, you would have to pull together your own course pack. And so one of the things I was able to do as part of the series and working with Linda Mora, was put together Learn, Teach, Challenge, which is one of the first anthologies of this kind of textbook that could be used at either upper undergraduate or the graduate level. And then right after that, Sophie had a similar idea for a textbook for first year university, because that's what university professors want to do. They want to assign a textbook and take something off the shelf and start teaching. They don't want to have to create everything, especially at sort of key moments. And so Read, Listen, Tell was Sophie's project. I was very grateful to be part of that, along with Dave Gertner and Gabrielle Larondel Hill. And so these, you have these sort of foundational texts are just examples. There are many, many other authors that came on board and contributed. And I would say that maybe the Indigenous Studies series, or was previously known as the Aboriginal Studies series, it had a real focus on Indigenous studies, but maybe not literary studies as much. So I think that's been a contribution of my time there. And I just passed the baton to Daniel Heath Justice. So I'm looking forward to seeing what he comes up with next.
You just heard from Dr. Deanna Reder. Dr. Reder is the current chair of the Department of Indigenous Studies at Simon Fraser University and author of Autobiography as Indigenous Intellectual Tradition, Cree and Métis Achemisowina, published by Wilfrid Laurier University Press. This series is brought to you with support from Wilfrid Laurier University Press. Join us next week for a deeper dive into Dr. Reder's book, how it came about, and some of the external inspirations for her study of Indigenous autobiography.
Having grown up with so many, autobiographical stories or Achemisowina life experience stories is what Joanna Archibald calls them, rather than what are considered sort of traditional legends and the kind of story cycles or the epics of, in this my case, the Cree worldview,
right?
I came to realize wasn't it only a deficiency. Obviously, I think being able to draw on more is more. I would love to have grown up hearing Wissahichuk stories, but I didn't. Instead, I grew up hearing family stories, and in those stories, I began to realize that rather than the intellectual inheritance wasn't lost, but it was instead embedded in a different way.
As always, sponsorship and advertising for the Authority File podcast are handled by Choice's advertising manager, Pam Marino, and all of our episodes are produced and edited by Choice's digital media producer, Sabrina Kofer. That's all for this week. Thanks for joining us.